Mars, the red planet. Rockets have reached its bone-dry surface, but not people. The space between Earth and Mars is a hostile place to travel. Even specks of meteor dust could smash a spaceship apart. Getting there will require untested human courage and the best minds in science. But sometime early in the next century, we could send astronauts to our neighboring planet.
Mission Control, Explorer 1 has landed.
The journey is 250 million miles. It would last 2.5 years, including 18 months on the Martian surface. The greatest adventure since mankind landed on the moon. This time, the destination is Mars. Only a third the size of Earth, its volcanoes are as wide as the state of Missouri, and its tallest mountain soars 3 times higher than Everest. Some river valleys are as wide as the Grand Canyon is long. Gravity here is less than half of what it is on Earth. Days are only a few minutes longer, but a year is twice as long. And it's so cold that all its water is locked up in the polar ice caps or frozen beneath the surface.
We have a go for engine start. 6.
For most of us, a mission to Mars might seem like science fiction, but in fact, we're almost ready to take off.
I believe in the very early part of the 21st century, people will set foot on Mars.
Every piece of technology that's needed to do this mission basically exists today.
Mars is a place that we can go and live, and that makes it completely different than any other planet in our solar system.
We will have youngsters. We have second-generation Martians who will say, hey, my grandmother and grandfather back in the umpteenth century came from Earth.
The technology exists to go to Mars. Since the days of Apollo, a dedicated few have kept the dream alive by developing ingenious ways of surviving in space. But success hinges on a few stunning breakthroughs. New technologies would reduce the cost of the mission by 90% and cut travel time in half. And the countdown has started. Sometime early in the 21st century, the first manned mission to Mars could be ready. Their goal, to look for proof of life on Mars. They'll also search for valuable minerals and test the feasibility of human settlement. The trip would be timed to start as the Earth was about to swing past the red planet, which occurs once every 26 months. With a tug from Martian gravity, they would use less fuel and get there in just 6 months. One design on the drawing boards is for a Mars spacecraft at 27 feet in diameter, divided into 2 decks. The upper deck contains the crew's quarters, which would also double as their habitat on Mars. worldwide interest in Mars has never been greater since NASA held a press conference to announce the discovery of this small meteor. Knocked off the surface of Mars many millions of years ago, it crashed into the Earth by chance. Inside, scientists found minerals that could only have formed in water. Along with the minerals were other structures that could have been produced by bacteria-like creatures.
The simplest explanation to us is that they are the remains of Martian life.
The meteor, and another discovered by British scientists, were tantalizing clues we might not be alone in the universe. But not everyone agreed with the evidence. Is there really life on Mars? It's an age-old question that's puzzled scientists for centuries and triggered an ongoing debate about manned or unmanned missions.
There's a thought that maybe we ought to send people to try and understand the history of life on Mars. The issue is we send robots to do a broad reconnaissance of the planet to isolate those places where humans might go. And after we send robots on the surface, we want to bring back samples with robots to get even more evidence. And then, if the evidence is overwhelming, then we go and we send people.
Carol Stoker of NASA's Ames Research Center has spent the better part of her career trying to make Mars exploration practical using mobile rovers. By the year 2006, as many as half a dozen different-sized rovers are scheduled to land on Mars and send back surface information. One of the most capable is the Russian Marsokhod, which can travel hundreds of miles. But controlling rovers long distance is difficult. Images or commands can take 20 minutes to travel just one way. To beat the time delay, Carol Stoker designed a virtual reality system for driving rovers without waiting for confirmation and gathering information needed to choose landing sites for a human mission. But it's doubtful remote-controlled rovers alone will answer our big questions about Mars.
Detailed interaction with the surface will always be very difficult to control from Earth and very difficult to automate. So, for example, suppose that you had found what you thought was evidence of life on Mars. Suppose you'd found the fossil.
Even with instant TV images and real-time control, the so-called teleoperation system an astronaut might use from a base on Mars, just getting a look at an interesting rock is still complicated. To get the camera into position takes many separate commands. After each command, the driver must wait to see where the arm is, then decide where to move next. Add a 20-minute delay, and taking a rock sample with a geologist's hammer would be excruciating.
It might take a month or even a year to do the same task from the Earth you could do in an hour if you were there, live, or if you were even there in teleoperation mode.
Shuttle astronaut and Mars enthusiast Tom Jones shares Stoker's opinion.
We can only answer questions about the origins of life on Mars by going there and exploring in detail. It might take microscopes and toothpicks to find the answer in Martian fossils. It might require digging below the surface. And all of those tasks can't be addressed by landing simple robots on the surface. It's going to take human explorers in their laboratories and a long-term presence there to establish those answers.
Nobody is more passionate about sending humans to Mars than this group of scientists who call themselves the Mars Underground. Ever since 1981, they've been holding conferences to show skeptics how such a mission could be done.
These guys fly out to Mars. They fly out in convoy with another Earth return vehicle, which is their backup, but which, if they don't need it, can be used to open up a second site.
Bob Zubrin, one of the Mars Underground's most outspoken members, is full of ideas on how to cut the cost of sending people to Mars.
The most important person on the mission is the mechanic, the person who can fix the spacecraft systems, okay? Because that is what everybody's lives and the success of the mission depend upon. The other discipline that is important to the mission is that of field scientists, because that's what the mission is about. Therefore, what I say is 2 of each. If you had a 5th member and he's a doctor, you're adding 20% mass to the mission.
The idea here is that it's divided into 2 levels. You got laboratory.
In the 60s, during the Apollo program, money was no object in the race to beat the Russians to the moon. But now that the Cold War is over, funding a trip to Mars will clearly be a challenge.
We can't become a bunch of lazy engineers and mission designers and managements and say all the sloppy management and high-cost engineering we've done is okay because we'll just ask the public to pay more and they're enthusiastic about it. We have to go to the public with high value for their dollar.
You're going to Mars to live there.
The focus of this year's meeting is to design a program of 5 Mars missions costing a total of $32 billion. If the United States paid half and the international community paid the rest, that would come to $2 billion a year. As to why to go there in the first place, everybody in the Mars underground has strong reasons.
I'm a biologist, so I have this burning need to know about life in the universe. And the most likely planet in our solar system to contain either any present remnants of life or past remnants of life is Mars.
Did it have life in its past, when it had water, when it was like Earth? Could life survive there present, human life in particular? And could life be introduced to Mars in such a way that changed the planet into an Earth-like environment?
Mars is the new world. Mars is a planet which is waiting for human beings to go there, to explore it, to pioneer it, and to settle it. It's a place where a new branch of human civilization can be established.
Mars is a place that we can go and live, and that makes it completely different than any other planet in our solar system.
Many of the Mars underground leaders met each other as students here at the University of Colorado in Boulder. From time to time, they would gather at the campus observatory to share their dreams of exploring and colonizing other planets. Looking into the night sky, they often aimed their telescope at Mars, like one of America's most celebrated astronomers, Percival Lowell. Back in the 1890s, Lowell used his powerful telescope to capture some of the first detailed images of the red planet. Observing intense shifts in its climate and faint features that crisscrossed its surface, Lowell concluded that Mars was covered by an intricate network of canals, built by a desperate civilization trying to cope with alternating floods and droughts. Percival Lowell was not alone in his vision of a Martian civilization, but his work inspired an avalanche of science fiction about what Martians looked like and our first encounter with them. Tales of alien creatures captured the imagination of generations of children, many of whom went on to become part of the Mars underground.
When I was a boy, I used to read a lot of science fiction. They were certainly exciting stories of how people could go out there and create and build and adventure, and certainly the desire to be part of that adventure was a great thing for me and excited me to become a scientist. Now, in many respects, those stories were inaccurate. Sometimes the technical details were wild, and in almost all respects, their understanding of what Mars and the other planets were like were way off. But in a fundamental sense, I think they had more truth than falsehood, because what they showed is that these planets are worlds.
The origin of my interest in going to Mars actually came from a dream I had when I was a kid. I was about 8 years old, and I was on vacation at my grandparents' house, and for 5 or 6 nights running, I had this serial dream about going to Mars. And the dream started with, getting in the rocket ship and going to Mars, and then these various events happened, and as I recall, I was on Mars for about 2 years, and I met these different people, and in fact, I met my husband and got married and came back to Earth at the end of the dream. And I believed completely from that point forward that I was going to Mars.
American spacecraft rendezvoused with Mars 6 times between 1964 and 1976, Viking 1 and 2 actually landing on the surface. The payoff was spectacular. They sent back images of a planet that looked remarkably like our own. To see if there was life on Mars, each Viking lander scooped up a sample of soil. Of 4 chemical tests run on each sample, 3 were positive. But the results of the 4th and most important test were negative, leaving the question still unanswered. Photos taken from orbit showing strange parallel lines and a rock with the impression of a face rekindled speculation about a lost civilization. But it was images like this, what looks like frost on a summer morning, that intrigued scientists most. Ancient river channels signaled that Mars used to be warmer and had flowing water. And polar ice caps gave proof that water was still there.
They showed us the real Mars. They showed us a planet that was not like we had imagined, not with canals and civilizations, but they showed us things that were just as interesting. They showed us that at one time Mars was a different world, a wet world, an active world, maybe a lifelike world. And that image, the notion that there was at one time 2 Earth-like planets in our solar system, has been the driving focus for Mars research ever since.
Mars Explorer 1, you're go for TMI.
After checking all systems on their spacecraft, the crew would take its last look at planet Earth as it prepared to leave the relative safety of Earth orbit.
Roger, go for trans-Mars injection. 30 seconds till burn.
In 10 minutes, they would burn all the fuel in their upper stage rocket and begin the long coasting ride to the red planet. This would be the last time Mission Control could directly oversee a critical maneuver.
10 seconds till burn.
Soon, the spacecraft would be out of the range of communication.
Engines armed.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
The end of the burn would signal the first momentous step for a 6-month journey to Mars.
Success to Mars.
Hey!
With the upper stage rocket and its fuel gone, the crew would have reached the point of no return.
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
When Apollo 11 landed on the moon in 1969, going to Mars no longer seemed like science fiction, and the world was riveted.
I came back and listened to people who would come up to me and say, I want to tell you where I was when you were up there. Time after time after time, the lives of people on this planet were changed because they experienced something that had never happened before. They were a witness to history, and they experienced that.
That's beautiful. This has got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you.
By the 6th moon landing, American astronauts had become experts in planetary exploration.
Have at it.
The technology to work, move around, and survive outside a spacecraft had been tested and refined. But human ventures beyond the Earth ended with Apollo 17.
When Apollo ended, I think technologically we were on the threshold of developing a capability to go to Mars. Matter of fact, Jack Schmidt and I said when we came home that by the turn of the century, we'd be on our way to Mars. But we couldn't gin up the spirit of the country to move on and to press on at that point in time. And I think people, in essence, I hate to say this, but, almost lost interest.
I think we probably optimistically felt, well, bring on Mars, we'll take that on, we can do that. And since then, I think we've found out that it's a little bit more involved in doing that.
On the 20th anniversary of the first moon landing, Mars loomed like the next frontier.
From the voyages of Columbus to the Oregon Trail to the journey to the moon itself, history proves that we have never lost by pressing the limits of our frontiers. We must commit ourselves anew to a sustained program of manned exploration of the solar system, and yes, a manned mission to Mars.
NASA's plan called for launching over 1,000 tons of materials, fuel, and supplies into orbit on dozens of rockets and assembling them in space. But the plan soon ran into trouble.
The problem with the NASA plan was they had to build a giant spaceship because they were bringing out to Mars all the fuel and oxygen they needed to come home. That was 80% of the mass they were sending to Mars. Now, in fact, it never got out of the dock because it was so expensive with a cost estimate of $450 billion. The Congress refused to fund it and the program was killed.
To get the mission back on track, Bob Zubrin and fellow engineers at Lockheed Martin Astronautics came up with the idea of making fuel for the return voyage on Mars. Their goal was to use the Martian atmosphere for raw material, something that they could simulate in the lab.
Start the electrolyzer.
To convert the atmosphere into fuel, they chose a simple chemical reaction that's been known for over a century. Then they built a prototype to see if it would work. One chamber of the machine is filled with an absorbent powder that could literally soak up carbon dioxide from the Martian atmosphere. In a second chamber, the gas is mixed with a small amount of hydrogen, the only raw material that would have to be brought from Earth.
And they will react to produce methane, natural gas, great rocket fuel, and water.
The water is sent to a third chamber where electrolysis produces the oxygen that's needed for burning methane fuel. A small machine like this could supply all the fuel and oxygen needed for the return voyage from Mars and for powering a surface vehicle. Every pound of hydrogen brought from Earth could produce 12 pounds of methane and oxygen, allowing Mars pioneers to live off the land.
Instead of having to launch a 1,000-ton spaceship into Earth orbit, you launch maybe 200 tons. And maybe you do that in 2 launches, each of 100 tons. Hey, we had boosters that could do that 30 years ago. Okay? If you adopt this approach to Mars of living off the land, it basically means we can do the mission with the technology we have now, or frankly, the technology that we had decades ago.
The Saturn V boosters that launched Apollo back in the 1960s, each capable of lifting over 140 tons, are ideal for launching a Mars spacecraft into Earth orbit. But the only Saturn V's left today are museum pieces on display at NASA space centers, so production would have to begin again. An alternative is the slightly less powerful Russian booster, the Energia. Test launched twice, the factory that built it still exists. Or the shuttle booster could be modified to launch a Mars vehicle in 2 or 3 pieces for assembly in space. A small reusable rocket NASA is currently developing would require more trips, but could be less expensive. The same upper stage rocket that took Apollo to the moon could be used for the journey from Earth's orbit to Mars. Returning from Mars is where Zubrin's machine comes in. He would split every Mars mission into 2 launches in a plan called Mars Direct.
In your first launch, you fire off to Mars an unmanned payload consisting of an Earth return vehicle. Okay, this is a little rocket ship that's going to be used to fly back from Mars to Earth with a crew of 4 astronauts in it, but no one's in it right now. It flies out to Mars unfueled. Its fuel tanks are empty. And once it's landed on Mars, it makes the fuel and oxygen it needs to come home. It takes perhaps 5 to 10 months to make the fuel. Of course, the people on Earth have monitored this, so long before the next launch window opens up, we'll know we have a fully fueled Earth return vehicle waiting for us on Mars.
The crew would land their spacecraft within a few miles of the return vehicle. When the time came to leave, it would be abandoned. Because Mars Direct is economical, NASA mission planners like John Connolly embraced the idea with only a few changes.
Morning, everyone. Hello, John. Understand you don't like us staying on Mars for 500 days. You want to go shorter.
The major change was to put a large return spacecraft in Mars orbit so that when the crew blasted off from Mars, they could transfer to something with a little more legroom. But the basic idea of living off the land had taken hold.
When we're going to Mars, we're going to start thinking again like the pioneers did. We're going to start using the land for our subsistence as much as we can. If you think about the early pioneers that pioneered the American West, they didn't load up their Conestoga wagons with their logs to build their log cabins. They went to wherever they were going in the Midwest and they started cutting down trees there. They lived off the land. They started growing their food there. They didn't bring it all with them. If they tried to bring everything they needed with them, they would have never made it past the Appalachians. We're going to Mars in the same way.
NASA planners are now looking for other ways to make going to Mars cheaper. If they find them, and if robotic missions provide enough scientific reason to go, they'll have the support of NASA's director, Dan Golden.
It would be my wildest dream. It would be the achievement of a lifetime if I could lead this agency out of Earth orbit and on to places like Mars and asteroids to help us understand who we are and what we are and to enrich life on this planet.
Mission Control, do you copy?
By 9 days into a Mars mission, the spacecraft would be 10 million miles away from home. Earth would have become just another dot in the sky. This far into the journey, the astronauts would still be able to have twice-a-week video conferences with home. But as they get farther away, the time delay would grow longer and more awkward.
By the way, I've been thinking a lot about that leak in the family room. And I think we should just go ahead and have the whole roof replaced.
At this point, the delay would be 5 seconds.
Okay, I'll call the roofers tomorrow. He can do the work in a month, which is great. And there's somebody here who wants to say something to you. I miss you. I miss you too.
Scientists are developing the technology to recycle air and water for a Mars mission, including a machine that can turn urine into drinkable water. The equipment sits in a 3-story airtight chamber. During the summer of 1996, 4 volunteers put the system through its first real-life test. Sealed for 1 month, they relied on machines to recycle their wastes and to purify the air and water. Everybody stayed healthy. But NASA is also developing another life support system using plants that could be grown on Mars. To test it, volunteer Nigel Packham lived in a pair of airtight containers for 2 weeks. Wheat plants provided him with all the air he needed to breathe. As Nigel used up oxygen and produced carbon dioxide, the plants absorbed the carbon dioxide and produced new oxygen. The question was, could humans and plants stay in balance? Computers monitored the air in the living chamber, adjusting the amount of light on the wheat plants to alter their production of oxygen.
The plants have performed wonderfully. They react very quickly to me being here and to changes in my metabolic output. For example, if I sit on the bicycle and start exercising for 30 minutes, and I tend to put out a lot more carbon dioxide, the plants react very, very rapidly to that. So it's almost as if they know I'm here.
The plant-based system had passed its first test. NASA's ultimate goal is something similar to what was attempted by Biosphere 2 during the early 1990s. In that experiment, 8 scientists locked themselves up for 2 years to test the feasibility of living in a totally sealed artificial world. Inside were replicas of many of the major ecosystems on Earth. But thorough as they tried to be in reproducing the natural ecosystems of the Earth, the experiment ran into serious trouble. After a year and a half, oxygen had to be added to the closed system because the plants weren't producing enough. And crew members sometimes went hungry. In another experiment, a NASA scientist is taking a much less natural approach to using plants for a complete life support system.
Hi, Greg. Almost ready for harvest this afternoon?
Almost ready.
Here in a chamber just 200 feet square, David Bubenheim has plants growing 10 to 20 times more densely than they do in nature. Rather than imitate real ecosystems, he's manipulating the plants in every artificial way possible to achieve a healthy and steady harvest.
People are going to depend on this for their life. So we're trying to be able to show that we can maintain for an extended period of time all the food, all the air, all the water that a crew needs while recycling their wastes.
The big challenge for closed life support systems is the 2 to 3 pounds of waste that humans produce each day. In Bubenheim's plant system, waste is first sent to a machine that distills out the water, boiling it with excess heat captured from the greenhouse.
The water that comes out of the machine is not quite potable quality. It's certainly much cleaner than the sewage that went in, but it still has some ammonia and some organics in it. And we still have to remove that before it's potable.
The chemicals make perfect plant food, so the almost clean water is recycled back into the greenhouse. As the plants take up the water and grow, they naturally give off water vapor, which is turned into liquid again by condensers that line the sides of the greenhouse. The water has essentially been distilled twice, making it safe to drink.
Oh, that's good.
Thanks to the addition of some artificial nutrients and high-intensity lamps, the plants in Bubenheim's greenhouse grow rapidly and produce tremendous amounts of food. After each harvest, the old plants are replaced. What looks sparse now will be ready to harvest again in just a few days. Over the years, Bubenheim has been able to grow an impressive variety of crops. The food is routinely checked for quality, and every now and then, Bubenheim and his staff cook up a potluck supper. They're now confident they could have their revolutionary plant-based life support system up and running by the year 2005. Based on experience with the prototype, they know exactly how big a system would be needed to support a real base on Mars.
This chamber is about 200 square feet, and for a crew of 4 people, it would be able to supply and recycle all of the air and water. But it wouldn't supply 100% of the food in that case. To do that, you would need an area about 4 times this large, or a chamber about this size per person.
Bubenheim is now experimenting with the color of light to try to reduce the energy needed to run the system.
Well, in all the scenarios we're considering for a space-based habitat, energy is extremely limited. And if we're going to take electricity and make light, we need to use it very efficiently. If you look at these wheat plants that are growing under white light, like plants would outside, where all colors of the spectrum are represented, you can see that there are a number of smaller side shoots that are grown.
Those side shoots are waste that has to be recycled because it's only the taller center shoots that produce grain. But growing the wheat under blue light eliminates the side shoots, leaving the important center ones unharmed. Red light works the same. If the color of light can reduce the waste for crops other than wheat, plant-based life support will become even more attractive. But can a plant-based system work reliably over an entire Mars mission? At least one astronaut fears there could be a crisis, just as there was in Biosphere 2. Story Musgrave.
If there is any form of virus, bacteria, disease, or the plants for some reason become not healthy, then that balance is thrown off and it's fatal.
The kinds of designs that we're looking at in actually building one of these for space would actually provide us some segregation. So if the disease were to come into one section, it could easily be separated and quarantined so that the disease didn't spread to the rest of the plants.
Roger, Mars Explorer 1.
During such a long mission, astronauts would keep themselves busy by working on such projects as the onboard greenhouse. They would have free time between reviewing mission plans. A lesson learned from the Apollo was that what can go wrong will go wrong.
I was driving the only car within 250,000 miles away from home, and I knocked a fender off, which some of my friends think that was probably expected.
Losing that fender left Cernan's rover kicking up so much dust that it threatened his equipment. The mission was in jeopardy if they couldn't build a new one.
We made the fender out of some geology maps that were sort of excess, and we were able to tape those together while they were clean and didn't have any dust on them. We taped 4 of them together, and then we were able to fold them over and extend the length of the fender that I had knocked off over the wheels so that lunar dust wouldn't just get thrown in the air and come down upon everything. That was a very critical fix.
The ability to make repairs in space is crucial, but carrying tons of spare parts into space is impractical. But what if astronauts could call up a computer drawing of a broken part, then build a plastic or metal replacement from the ground up? NASA's working on the technology now, so it should be ready in time to go to Mars.
Start translating up the docking module.
To install spare parts, NASA's entering virtual reality. In the virtual world, astronauts can practice making repairs during a spacewalk before actually taking one. They quickly learn the layout of things and simulate attaching and removing objects on the outside.
Well, I think on a mission to Mars that can take anywhere between 2 and 3 or 4 years to accomplish the mission. All your training would be done on the ground, possibly 2 or 3 years before you ever needed it. So what the virtual reality or the onboard training would allow you to do would be refresh yourself to what you'd learned a couple of years before you did it.
It is inevitable that repairs would need to be made during a mission to Mars. Equipment failures are just one of the many hazards of the mission. Another is cosmic radiation. Because totally shielding a spacecraft would make it too heavy, the crew would get about half the dose that an airline pilot gets over an entire career. Micrometeorites in space whirl around at speeds greater than 30,000 miles an hour. A strike by one smaller than a pencil eraser could cause disaster. And most ominous would be the powerful solar flares that send deadly ions throughout the solar system without warning. On Earth, the atmosphere stops most cosmic rays from reaching the surface, and all but the largest meteors burn up. Even the deadly ions from solar flares are deflected by the Earth's magnetic field. For travelers out of Earth orbit, there would be no protection. But as the Russian space station Mir revealed, the greatest risk to the crew on the long voyage to Mars may be weightlessness. Our bones and muscles are only as strong as they need to be. In space, with no gravity to tug on the human body, bones lose calcium and muscles lose strength. In 1995, the United States began sending astronauts to the Mir to see how the Russians managed to stay in space for a year or more. Astronaut Shannon Lucid broke the American record, 6 months. Astronaut Norman Thagard spent 4 months on Mir, with the Russians a likely partner on the mission to Mars. Thagard collected detailed information on his body's reaction to zero gravity, but mostly he tested Russian techniques for counteracting the effects of weightlessness.
The Russians have a lot of experience in long-duration spaceflight, and they realize that if you don't exercise diligently when you're on these long-duration missions, then you won't be in good shape when you return. Toward that end, the Russians schedule 2 one-hour exercise sessions a day.
The goal of these exercises is to subject bones and muscles to the same forces and stresses they would get on Earth, so that they can remain tuned for Earth's gravity.
Knowing as I did, because I am a medical doctor, that I would quickly get out of shape if I didn't exercise, I was extremely diligent in exercise for the whole while I was on the Mir station.
When Thagard returned, everyone was eager to see if his exercising had paid off.
When we landed, within 10 minutes of wheel stop, I stood up. Wasn't the easiest thing I ever did, but I did stand up, and I remained standing until they opened the doors and got everybody out ahead of me, and then I walked off the vehicle unassisted.
But many cosmonauts have trouble making themselves exercise, like Vladimir Titov, who spent 13 months on the Mir.
Unfortunately for me, it's very unpleasant to exercise when I don't want to. If you like exercising and only have to do it 3 times a week, that's fine. But when you have to do it twice a day, every day for a year, it becomes a boring, hellish task.
Even if cosmonauts follow their exercise routine, some can't cope with gravity after 6 months or more in space.
The issue of what sort of shape folks need to be in when they get to Mars is probably a bigger one than it is for low Earth orbit, in the sense that in low Earth orbit, all you have to do is come back, and if need be, they can carry you off the vehicle. But when a crew is going to Mars and they arrive, they need to be in good enough shape to do real work.
Rotating a spaceship to produce artificial gravity has long been considered the ideal solution to the exercise problem. The principle behind artificial gravity is a familiar experience. When a roller coaster goes around a loop, it creates centrifugal force, which presses it into the track. A rotating spaceship would also produce centrifugal force, pinning astronauts to the spaceship floor, simulating gravity. As an engineering student at Stanford University, John Wilson tested one of the most promising and economical ideas for creating artificial gravity. Using 2 air-powered hover machines tethered together, Wilson showed they could rotate around a center point, as would a spacecraft. Tiny thrusters around each machine fire at just the right time to keep the system stable. The concept proved successful, but it would be a lot more complicated in space.
Whereas this experiment is only about 5 feet in diameter, in space we'd have something that was very large, perhaps as large as half a mile in diameter.
It's unclear how long it would take to build and test a spacecraft based on artificial gravity. So scientists at the NASA Ames Research Center are now investigating another way to produce it. Here, in a chamber that's small enough to be launched in the space shuttle, they've built a bicycle centrifuge, a new exercise machine that harnesses the pedaling power of 2 people to spin one of them around at high speed.
Ready.
The astronauts get a good aerobic workout, and by taking turns on the centrifuge, they also get a strong dose of artificial gravity. even if the person rotating gets dizzy and stops pedaling, centrifugal force would continue creating pressure towards his feet, giving his bones and muscles the stress they need to stay in shape. The most promising technology for counteracting the harmful effects of weightlessness was recently tested by NASA in a bed rest study. First, volunteers laid in bed with their heads tilted down, a position that caused the same problems astronauts get from zero gravity.
You do, have a little lower back pain, get a headache usually. I think maybe my head's a little fuzzy sometimes too from being in this position, so it's kind of difficult.
Fluids move up to my head, I started getting puffy and my nose starts getting congested.
Your muscles start to atrophy, and that continues, and then eventually you'll start losing bone.
These tests are obviously no picnic for the people who do them.
What's the surprise?
It tastes good at first, but getting it down past your throat gets more difficult.
The object of all the inconvenience was to test a new, improved treadmill for use in space. The problem with current treadmills is that they rely on elastic straps to produce force, and elastics pull harder the farther you stretch them. If the elastic is strong enough for an astronaut to feel his normal weight when he gets on the treadmill, then the elastic will be too tight for him to lift his body up and run. So to be usable, space treadmills can only have weak elastics that produce moderate force, which limits their ability to maintain bones and muscles. The new machine uses a vacuum pump to pull the runner into the treadmill, allowing much higher forces. To simulate a workout in space, Brent Walker had to run lying down so the Earth's gravity wouldn't be a factor.
Brent, we're putting up the treadmill now.
Okay.
So if you can pick yourself up,
Okay, vacuum's on. Okay, I'm bringing it up to full body weight.
As the vacuum sucked air out of the chamber, Brent's feet were pulled into the treadmill. Lying sideways, yet feeling like he was standing upright and bearing his normal weight, was an odd sensation.
You do get used to it, and sometimes it feels like you're almost flying effortlessly. It's a very strange feeling. You do sweat, though.
Because the machine is experimental, Brent was asked to rate his stress.
Exertion? It's a 13.
13? Okay. Heart rate's 170.
Feeling your normal weight while exercising in space would be double what astronauts get from elastic straps, but the treadmill can also make you feel much heavier.
Okay, Brent, I'm bringing the pressure up to 1.2 body weight.
The harder the vacuum pulls, the more stress on Brent's bones and muscles.
Well, it feels like I have a backpack on, about 30 pounds, something like that. It's just a lot heavier. Definitely just stressing my lungs and my muscles a lot more. It's hard.
The question is, will 40 minutes a day on this vacuum treadmill prevent bone and muscle loss during this study?
I feel my muscles are a lot stronger. They've actually, since I came into it, they've gotten a lot stronger. So I would imagine that it will help me. I mean, it's really difficult from my point of view, to know until I actually stand up.
After 2 weeks in the bed rest study, the moment of truth arrived.
Your mark, get set, go.
Brent actually ran faster than before he got into bed.
On your mark, get set, go.
But those who didn't use the treadmill during the study, like Bill Davis, were much slower than before.
I think it's just a feeling of sort of weakness, of not having a lot of energy or a lot of strength.
Okay. Make sure your heel is resting here. Okay, now let's start. Okay, push, 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 push. Okay, relax. Okay, another one. Push, push, push. Okay, relax. Okay, push, 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 push. Relax. Okay, now push, push.
But those like Brent who did exercise stayed the same or got stronger. Clear evidence that the vacuum treadmill works. Bone loss was assessed by a machine which uses vibrations against the leg to determine bone stiffness.
Feel the weight? Is it uncomfortable?
Just a little bit, but it won't be a problem.
While the results were much less clear-cut than they were from muscles, they do seem to indicate the vacuum treadmill would help astronauts headed to Mars.
If this is any indication, they would be much better off than they would be without it. So this is definitely a good step in keeping people fit in space.
This is Mars Explorer 1, 10-4.
It would take about 102 days for a Mars mission to reach the halfway point on a journey to the Red Planet. Each morning would begin with a routine 1-hour exercise session, including the vacuum treadmill. Astronauts would know the importance of being in good shape when they get to Mars, where they would have to deal with gravity again. The crew would use regular exercise to relieve their boredom during this part of the mission.
I'll be up front. All right, I'll come and get you if I need you.
But there could also be times when no one would think about exercise. On board, alarms might warn that invisible but deadly ions from a solar flare have penetrated the spacecraft. Every second of exposure can increase damage to the body, so the crew would quickly retreat to the only shielded area. Barely 5 feet square, the emergency shelter would maintain a supply of food and allow control over the most vital systems on the spacecraft. The solar flares could last for a few hours or a week or even longer. Travel in deep space is inherently dangerous and unpredictable.
Frontiers like Mars are vital for people because they give us freedom and they give us challenge. What a frontier does, like the American West, is it throws people into a new situation where they are both free to innovate and forced to innovate because the old ways of doing things no longer work. They're forced to throw off the moss. They're forced to break off the barnacles. They're forced to create something new. And that's when people display really what is best in them. That's when they're most challenged.
Today, there are 6 billion people on this planet. When I was born, there were 2 billion people on this planet. In less than 3 generations, the number of people on this planet has tripled. In the next 2 generations, it's going to double again. That's 12 billion people. These people need resources. That's one of the major reasons we would consider Mars.
Apollo taught us that a manned mission to Mars will be the most difficult psychological challenge any human has ever faced. On Apollo 17, astronaut Gene Cernan was thinking about the risks he was taking throughout the entire journey.
Stand by for touchdown. Stand by. 25 feet. Down at 2. Getting a little dust. Feels good.
There's a lot of excitement, a lot of things going on during the landing, a lot of noise, if you will, dust and things happening.
10 feet. Stop contact. Stop push. Engine stop.
All of a sudden you get to the point where you touch down and you shut the engine down. At that point, it is perhaps the most quiet moment in the entire life of any human being everywhere, because it stops. The dust stops, the noise stops, the motion stops, and you just sit there and listen for hissing or tanks that are leaking or whatever. There you are in the middle of this magnificent desolation. Should you fall and rip your suit, you're in trouble. And then you get in a car, an electric car, and you drive away from your home on the moon. You drive out of sight. You go over the hill and around the corner. Should the car break down? Well, we had rules. You can't go further than you have to be able to walk back.
Proceeded. 3, 2, 1. Ignition. Right away, Houston.
What would happen if that didn't fire? It not only had to fire when you left the surface, it had to burn within the exact length of time, or you wouldn't have made it into orbit. You would have slowly crashed back on the moon. You accepted those kinds of risks. The challenge, the opportunity, maybe some people wouldn't. But I've got to believe most people, given the opportunity, would have accepted the same level of risk that we accepted to go to the moon.
To be part of the effort to first stake out a human presence and actually make it permanent on another world is something that I would sacrifice a lot for. And so the risks involved, if they are weighed and measured and planned against, would be acceptable, just as we accept risk in going into space on the space shuttle. And the same kinds of risks that explorers accepted in the past history of human exploration on Earth would be analogous to those, and I think actually less in the case of going to Mars than we faced hundreds of years ago.
I would certainly like to see all of the various space programs work together with going to Mars as their objectives, because I think that would just be an outstanding thing for the different nations of the Earth together, to work together and toward the common goal of going to Mars. I just think it would be just absolutely marvelous, and I would like to see that happen within my lifetime.
Russia's space station Mir holds the record for flights of long duration. Today, cosmonauts spend up to 14 months in space, twice as long as the trip to Mars and almost half the length of the entire mission. Long stays can be enhanced by some of the comforts of home. Mir has even had a steam bath, where cosmonauts could take a traditional Russian banya complete with a birch branch. But the cosmonauts have learned that over time, things can go wrong, as they did for Vladimir Titov and Musa Maranov during their 13-month mission.
2 months into our flight, we had an orientation problem. The space station drifted out of alignment with the sun, and suddenly we couldn't charge our solar batteries, and so we lost energy. And that was scary because we had to turn off all the lights. The fans stopped. Electricity was low on the ship. We were trying to get out of this situation for a long time, about 3 weeks. We had to restore all the devices that didn't work.
While they could have taken a lifeboat capsule back to Earth, something that wouldn't be possible on a Mars mission, eventually they resolved the crisis. But then a new one arose.
There were moments when we got bored with each other. Mostly, it was the result of psychological stress. We never really fought. Instead, we just went to the porthole and observed the Earth. Did our own thing when we got bored. Fortunately, whenever we had important jobs to do together, all the problems between us would vanish.
How will we select a crew for the first human mission to Mars? People who can handle both the risks and the stress. The answer may lie behind these gates at Russia's cosmonaut training center, Star City. In the United States, psychological factors play a small role in deciding who goes into space. But in Russia, psychology is central. At all the milestones of a cosmonaut's training, someone like psychiatrist Oleg Rumin is there observing. Today, Oleg Kotov is taking his first ride in the centrifuge to see if he can withstand the G-forces of a rocket launch. To test his ability to concentrate under pressure, he's told to press a button every time these lights go on. Oleg will be subjected to nearly 7 Gs. The test lasts only 5 minutes. From a physical point of view, Oleg did fine. And from the psychological?
A little bit nervous, but this is the first rotation on a centrifuge for this young cosmonaut. And this is a good person. I like that.
After a solar flare crisis, the crew would regain access to the entire spacecraft. A top priority would be to assess whether electronic systems had been damaged by the radiation. Even though damage to a spacecraft may be minimal, mission planners anticipate stress to astronauts could be heavy. So they have developed ways to ease the tension with messages from loved ones. Because there would not be much room on the spacecraft to include scientific equipment or experiments that weren't specifically for use on Mars, the challenge would be to keep busy. Astronauts could spend hours gazing through the ship's telescope. Others might exercise. But all would be thinking about what lies ahead when they finally land on the red planet. One of Russia's most important psychological tests for choosing cosmonauts takes place in this room. Called the Serta Camera, or silent chamber, potential cosmonauts must spend 10 days here in solitary confinement, going without sleep for the first 3 days. Designed to simulate the stresses of a real mission, all communication with the cosmonaut is made through a series of color-coded lights. His first test is to count numbers. But there's a twist. The numbers are all scrambled, and the candidate must count forward with the black ones and backward with the red. The fewer errors he makes and the faster he counts, the higher his score. But to complicate things even more, a tape of someone else counting is piped into the room at the same time.
8 черные. 18 красные.
Now, the second test. Look at this. Can you remember these symbols? The cosmonaut candidate gets only 2 seconds to look at them, and then he has to write them down from memory. The stress begins to mount. When he gets sleepy, exercise is ordered. For the entire test, this pass-through cabinet is the only contact with the outside world. He's fed the same food cosmonauts eat in space. And as time ticks by, the pressure builds as it would for a cosmonaut on a hectic mission. Every few hours, he's asked to arrange a series of colored cards. According to Russian psychological theory, the order he chooses should reflect his state of mind. As fatigue sets in, he fights sleep, while commands keep coming. He gets slower at doing the tasks, but speed is no longer crucial.
Everyone gets tired, but some just stop working. They don't even struggle with the situation. They give up. Others keep working but make too many mistakes. Another bad reaction to sleep deprivation is hallucinating. If a person has hallucinations during the test, it's a strong sign that he shouldn't become a cosmonaut.
After 3 days of total sleep deprivation and 7 more with just a little sleep, the ordeal is over. For a lengthy Mars mission, stress tests will be the key to choosing the right astronauts. Here in Star City, psychologists also have a test to predict which cosmonauts will best get along with one another. It's called the homeostat, and oddly enough, the idea for it came from the communal showers where cosmonauts used to wash up after training. Psychologists observing the cosmonauts often heard complaints about the water temperature, but only when certain groups were in the shower. The problem, as one person made his shower hotter, everybody else's got colder. Psychologists concluded that if a group of cosmonauts could solve the problem among themselves by adjusting their showers, they were probably compatible. That's the concept behind the homeostat test, only instead of water, it uses an electronic box with a knob and a meter. Getting the needle to 0 is the equivalent of a warm shower. And even if you don't adjust your needle, it moves when your colleagues adjust theirs. At first, each member of the group started out making large movements with their knobs to get the feel of the device. The psychologist watched the drama unfold on a master display panel. Soon, Oleg decided to stop moving his knob, letting Tanya and Valery try to solve the problem first. It's much easier to get to 0 when only 2 people are adjusting their knobs. Once Tanya and Valery hit their targets, Oleg started making small knob movements that the others could adjust to, until at last everyone had a 0. According to the homeostat test, this group would get along fine in space. Aboard Mir, many of the things that crews treasure most on long-duration missions won't be available on a trip to Mars. Distance will prohibit the real-time back-and-forth video conferences with home that cosmonauts enjoy at least once or twice a week. Portholes, which allow the crew to look back on Earth whenever they're homesick, will be useless.
Everyone who flies in space looks out the window, and they do it almost at every opportunity they have. The sights are fantastic. It's not a view that you can get anywhere else.
If you couldn't sleep for some reason, you just go to the window and you could enjoy this Earth view for a very long time. In Mars flight, we will lose this opportunity.
A flight to Mars will be a frozen picture of unmoving stars, and the Earth will be just a dot among them.
A new computer system developed by NASA might help ease the pain by allowing Mars voyagers to take a bit of home with them.
This is when Dan and I were washing the dog, and we had a great time. He splattered soapy water all over us.
The concept was developed for American astronauts orbiting on the Mir, but it could equally be applied to a Mars journey. Before an astronaut leaves Earth, his family and friends would record images, sounds, and messages.
Hi. All right. Say cheese. Hi, Dad. It's really neat that you're in space. I'm really excited, and I can't wait for you to come back.
Back at NASA, they would be loaded into a computer for the family to edit the way they chose.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Dad. Happy birthday to you.
The end result would be a computerized photo album that an astronaut can browse at leisure. If all other communication with home failed, at least an astronaut would have this.
Well, ideally, we'd like to have the family update these with fresh video and fresh still pictures on a monthly basis and transmit those to the vehicle as it's moving to Mars or as it's coming back to Earth. But since transmission technology isn't always 100% reliable, at launch, we would like to have at least one video or still surprise per day of the mission on board that they can take with them.
Mission Control, this is Mars Explorer 1. Hope you're reading us.
Even after 192 days in space, the crew would still be able to communicate with their families.
Your mom had her checkup yesterday and her blood pressure's fine, so stop worrying.
But the time delay would be frustrating. The astronauts would have been drifting in the darkness of space for almost half a year.
How proud you are. Okay, I'm going to pause now, because I know you won't get this for another 20 minutes, and then I have to wait to hear back from you. So I think I'll go work in the garden for a while.
By this time, they would be close enough to Mars to make out some details. 10 more days, and they would be able to set foot on the red planet. A new rocket being developed at Johnson Space Center could end the loneliness of long-distance space travel. It's the idea of inventor and veteran shuttle astronaut Franklin Chang Diaz.
In terms of an astronaut, having flown in space, you become very aware of the solitude of being there and the fact that in a conventional mission to Mars, you're going to spend most of the time looking out the window with nothing really to see. The body is degraded and is severely affected by the conditions of weightlessness. So you would really want to make the trip very fast. And this is very exciting for us because for the first time, we actually are able to make a mission to Mars within 3 months.
Rather than burning gas, this rocket uses electricity to convert gas into a super high-energy state called plasma, which is then propelled out the back at tremendous speed. It won't push a Mars spacecraft any harder, but it would consume much less fuel, so it could operate longer than a conventional rocket and gradually gain more speed.
Okay, ready for the voltage adjustment, step number 3. A conventional rocket essentially pushes the rocket in a one shot by firing the engine until the fuel is completely depleted. The rocket really coasts most of the trip to Mars. Okay, we have 2 red indicators on the microwave. In our rocket, we can increase the speed by maybe factors of 5 or 7, and that is because we are accelerating all the time. And in fact, to travel to Mars, the rocket is always turned on. All right, step number 10 there, Laura. Air heat exchanger water valve open.
A Mars spacecraft using plasma rockets would need 3 small nuclear electric generators to make the plasma. Ironically, back in the 1960s, NASA developed another rocket that used nuclear energy called NERVA. It also didn't burn gas, but heated it to a very high temperature inside a nuclear reactor. In a series of tests, the rocket proved to be very efficient and lightweight. But the concept was ultimately abandoned because of public concern over nuclear power. NASA's plasma rocket would be impossible without nuclear electricity. So if we want to get to Mars quickly, going nuclear is the only way.
Start button to push. There you go.
Today's test is at low power to be sure all the components are working.
Okay, we're almost there. You're going to be ready, right? And go ahead and fire.
There it goes.
There it is. You can see the discharge. You got the discharge.
The purple glow of plasma gives Chang Diaz confidence his rocket will be up and running by the year 2005, in time to go to Mars. Lessons learned from Russia's space station could also benefit the mission to Mars. American astronaut Norman Thagard's 4 months on Mir proved that cultural and language differences could be a small but irritating problem.
I had already had a couple of years under my belt at that point of Russian language training, and I understood almost everything that they would say. I think I probably had more difficulty expressing myself precisely sometimes, so I didn't try things like jokes. I just always was mindful that if you blow a joke, you can wind up saying something you never intended to say. Gennady, on the other hand, constantly regaled me with jokes in Russian, and a lot of them I understood, and a lot of them I didn't understand. The one instance where culture really was a factor, we found out on board that Volodya, our commander's mother, had died. And I didn't know what the proper way was for Russians to react to a friend to whom that had happened. And what I had to do in that case is just watch Gennady and see how he behave toward Volodya and emulate Gennady.
To overcome the problem, NASA holds cultural training classes to prepare astronauts, as well as behind-the-scene personnel, for the new era of international missions.
Nice to meet you.
Здравствуйте. Sergei Nikolaevich Demonov.
Walter Barnett, how are you doing?
One of the techniques used is role-playing.
So you're an engineer with NASA.
The lesson here is about conflicting ideas of personal and private space.
Let me show you a picture of my wife, Sasha, and my son, Yuri.
Yeah.
And this is Marina, my daughter. Yeah. Where do you live, Walter?
Well, I actually live right over here in Nassau Bay.
How much do you make at NASA? How much money, your salary?
Well, I guess we get by, but I'd rather not. That's something I really don't want to discuss. So.
The hope is that by making people aware of the customs and expectations of others, cultural conflicts can be avoided.
You're looking great. You're looking great.
Yeah, thank you. You look good too. It's good to be back here in the United States.
After about 202 days, the Mars spacecraft would reach its destination and gravity would draw it into orbit. The captain would begin a last-minute virtual reality session to rehearse for the landing. He would have been practicing throughout the mission to be sure the descent to Mars would go smoothly. The Martian surface must be monitored closely for violent dust storms that can appear with little notice. Such a storm destroyed an unmanned Russian spacecraft that landed on Mars in the 1970s. From Mars orbit, the crew could also see the specific places they've come here to explore. Places where previous robotic missions detected minerals that might lead to evidence of Martian life, and to crucial underground supplies of water.
Mars has water. There's oceans of water frozen into the Martian soil as permafrost, enough that if the planet was flattened out and the water was melted out of the soil, the planet would be under 600 feet of water. Now that's dry compared to the Earth. If the Earth was flat, we'd be under 6,000 feet of water. But the Earth's a water world. If you got rid of the Earth's oceans and froze the rest of the water into the soil, the Earth would be about as wet as Mars.
With just 36 hours to go until the touchdown on Mars, a crew would exercise harder than ever. After 6 months of weightlessness, they would soon have to cope with gravity again. And moving around on the surface in a spacesuit would not be easy.
Man, it didn't feel like this stuff was that hard.
One of the most crucial technologies still lacking today for a Mars mission is a practical spacesuit. Apollo moon suits were little more than inflexible pressurized bags, adequate for life support but awkward for getting around. The Mark III spacesuit, designed and built at Johnson Space Center in Houston, is a major improvement. It was intended for zero-gravity work on the space station, so it's probably too heavy for Mars. But it demonstrates how putting dozens of airtight joints around the suit lets a person bend and move in a natural manner, while still getting the protection of a pressurized shell. The first steps for designing a Mars suit have already been taken in this water tank at the NASA Ames Research Center. Because people naturally float in water, to simulate Martian gravity, research subjects wear a series of weights distributed all around their bodies.
Okay, are you ready to exit onto Mars?
Martian gravity is 39% of the gravity we have on Earth, so a 150-pound man would weigh only about 60 pounds on Mars. He would also fall more slowly when he jumped up and down, but not this slowly.
Why don't you add about 4 in the front, and then add about 2 in the back, and then...
Bruce Webben is director of the spacesuit program here, and he's realized that his subject Eric needs a few more weights. Eric should now feel as heavy as if he were on Mars.
Okay, power's on. Motor's on.
Part of what Bruce Webben wants to know is how far a person's joints bend when he walks in Martian gravity. This will determine how flexible a Mars spacesuit must be to allow natural movement.
We're at 1 mile an hour now. We're going to go up to 3 miles an hour, okay? Okay, 3.
Webben also wants to know how much less energy it would take to walk in the lower gravity of Mars compared to on Earth.
As you decrease the gravity, it makes sense that the effort to move would probably be less. But if you go all the way to 0 gravity, then you can't walk. It's a completely different means of locomotion. And so the real interesting questions are what happens in between. And so we need to learn what sort of effort it takes to move and walk on Mars.
While the research subject exercises, Webben measures the carbon dioxide he produces, one way of gauging the expenditure of energy. This will determine how big an air tank astronauts will need to do a day's work on Mars, and how much air conditioning they'll need to stay cool.
If this kind of research isn't done, then what would typically happen is, as an engineer, you would over-design. So you would always design the system to be safe, but it would be much larger. The life support system would be much larger than it really needs to be, and the suit would not be optimized at all.
To perfect the design of a Mars spacesuit, Webben hangs weights at various places on a backpack frame. This will help determine the best place to concentrate the mass of the life support system, as well as where astronauts should carry things like tools or geological samples collected in the field. Each time the weights are moved, Webben measures how that affects the subject's balance, comfort, and energy consumption.
Eventually, we'll learn how to distribute the mass of the life support system. It won't necessarily be a backpack. It might be that it's more efficient to have the life support components distributed around the body, some of them in front, some of them in back.
Webben says he could build an ideal Mars suit in just 3 or 4 more years, but further work has now been put on hold by NASA. The crew must land their spacecraft near their return ship that arrived on Mars 2 years ago. By this time, it would have made the fuel needed to get
10
home.
seconds to deorbit burn. Enable engines.
Engines enabled.
Burn beginning.
Thrusters would reorient the craft to begin the descent to Mars.
Making contact with Mars atmosphere.
G level.
0.75 Gs.
Velocity. 2,000 meters per second. 1,700 meters per second.
1.9 Gs.
1,300
Their
meters
speed
per
would
second.
drop rapidly, and the G levels would climb as the spacecraft's huge aerobrake would produce friction with the Martian atmosphere.
600 meters per second.
Picking up signal from return vehicle.
1.9 Gs.
And locked onto target.
Ready to deploy main parachute. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Begin terminal descent burn.
200 feet.
80 feet. 40 feet. 25 feet. 10 feet. We're down.
Mission control, Explorer 1 has landed.
We have long dreamed about setting foot on Mars.
This is the proudest day of my life.
Television pictures would arrive back on Earth 20 minutes later.
It feels really strange walking, doesn't it?
the landscape has a similarity to the scenery back home. And the water-eroded hills suggest that Mars has a captivating story to tell. Almost 4 billion years ago, Mars and Earth were nearly twins. Both were warm and wet. But for reasons unknown, Mars rapidly became cold and dry. The Explorer 1 crew would land in one of the great river valleys where water was abundant during Mars' warmer days. A manned mission would hope to learn whether life got a foothold on Mars before conditions became so extreme, and whether life still exists beneath the surface today. But the crew's first priority would be to confirm that the return spacecraft that fueled itself from the Martian atmosphere was still in good shape for their journey home. They would also set up a series of weather stations to avoid being caught off guard by a Martian windstorm, which can gust up to 80 miles an hour. Only then would astronauts drill into the frozen floor of an ancient riverbed, searching for minerals, water, and evidence of life.
The possibility of finding some ancient form of fossilized life or some anaerobic life, that is, life that doesn't depend on oxygen living under the land on Mars, would be stunning. Because on this planet, we've all looked up at the sky and wondered, are we alone? Are we unique? Is life unique of any form, however complex or lowly, carbon-based or not? Is life unique to planet Earth?
One of the best places to search for evidence of past life will be in ancient Martian hot springs. On Earth, in places like Yellowstone National Park, hot springs are teeming with microscopic single-celled life. Evidence suggests that life on Earth began in this kind of hot and wet environment. Images sent back by Viking revealed abundant hot springs on Mars billions of years ago, when the planet was wetter and warmer than it is now. So there is a good chance Martian hot springs developed life too. But for NASA paleontologist Jack Farmer, there's something even more compelling about hot springs. Unlike other water environments that might have been on Mars, hot springs almost always leave good fossils of the organisms that lived there, and you don't need a microscope to see them.
Here on the edge of this hot spring, we have a place where microorganisms, bacteria, are being turned to fossils before our very eyes, the kind of fossils we'd like to look for on Mars. The orange areas out here are actually communities of bacteria, and you can see the interesting textures and structures that they produce as they grow upward toward the light. In general, the microorganisms thrive in these scalding hot waters, but the waters are also loaded with dissolved minerals, and as the water cools, particularly in shallow areas, the minerals come out of solution and coat the organisms and entomb them while they're still alive, producing sort of mummies, if you will.
A few feet away from the spring, an entire colony of bacteria coated with minerals has dried up and turned to stone. The structures and patterns visible to the naked eye could endure for billions of years.
We need to go back to Mars, and we need to look for these kinds of places, because these are the environments where that fossil record is likely to be preserved, and this will help us answer the question about life on Mars.
While ancient hot springs might be the best place to look for life, Farmer has also been collecting samples of large fossils that form in lakes and streams. All have unmistakable patterns that a paleontologist couldn't miss if he were actually walking around on the Martian surface.
I think we have good geological evidence of the right kinds of places to go to look for a fossil record of life. We're going to have a lot more evidence as upcoming missions unfold. But right now, I feel pretty confident, even based on Viking data alone, that we've targeted some important sites.
If there was life on Mars, how long did it survive as Mars evolved into a frigid and dry planet? The answer may lie in the Canadian Arctic, 400 miles from the North Pole. One of the original members of the Mars Underground is NASA scientist Chris McKay.
Sandstone formations are a couple hundred meters high here.
There is a rock outcrop I would like to explore more.
Along with biologist Imre Friedman, McKay has come here to see what life on Mars might look like in a bitterly cold environment. The Arctic is similar to what Mars would have been like when its climate became borderline for supporting life.
This place is a cold desert. The mean annual temperature is well below freezing. There's thick permafrost underneath us. But more importantly, this area is very dry. In fact, the light snow we see around could be considered a heavy snow for this area. The question we're asking is, can life survive here? Is it possible for life to adapt to these cold, dry conditions?
Okay, let's go and we will see.
Careful here, the snow is slippery. Watch your footing.
Not easy going.
If there is life here, it's fragile and hard to find. If it exists, it's hidden beneath the surface, out of sight. After hours of hiking without seeing a sign, McKay and his colleagues arrive at a spectacular sandstone formation.
Let's go over this one here.
Inside the rock, there is a surprise.
Look at this.
Oh, that's it. That's what we are looking for. The same
A black and green band of algae is just a tenth of an inch beneath the surface. Here in the Arctic, simple organisms were thriving inside rocks at a depth where sunlight could still penetrate to provide energy and where water would be stored in the pores of the rock.
The amazing thing is that this rock, if you were to look at it from the surface, would show no signs of life, no evidence of the living systems inside it. And yet it provides an excellent example of how life can grow in a very cold, very dry place. A cold desert like here, and a cold desert like on Mars.
Today on Mars, it's probably too cold and dry to find such organisms still alive. Only their fossil remains could still be found. But could life still thrive in some other environment?
all green inside.
Okay, let's bag it.
One of the best prospects of finding living microorganisms on Mars is Martian permafrost. Permafrost is frozen soil.
At the South Pole, a team of scientists drilling in the ice hit frozen water a foot beneath the surface containing a colony of living bacteria. If a subterranean world of microorganisms lurks below the surface of Mars, could larger life forms have existed there too?
If we compare Mars's history with Earth's history, we would expect that nothing more complicated than microorganisms evolved. But there may be reasons to think that maybe Mars went more quickly in its evolutionary trajectory than the Earth did. And maybe it's possible that Mars developed larger organisms on timescales that are shorter compared to how long it took to Earth. Mars is a smaller planet. It may have evolved faster. It may have built up oxygen in its atmosphere more rapidly. Who knows? These are all speculations. But how do we test these speculations? Of course, by going to Mars and looking for fossils.
A crew would be on Mars for a year and a half conducting field work.
We can be there in 2 hours.
For safety's sake, they travel in pairs. They would explore the bottom of ancient lakes where canyon walls slice through millions of years of Martian history, and with luck, they'll reveal some evidence of past life.
Nothing over here.
Paleontologists often go to great lengths to reach the best spots for fossils back on Earth. And on Mars, it won't be any different. Accidents could occur. People might even die. But that's the kind of risk humans have always taken to explore the unknown. But all the risk it took to get there might pay off in spectacular fashion. Within a rock like this, could there be unmistakable evidence that columns of bacteria-like creatures once lived on Mars? If so, our understanding of the universe will never be the same. With each new day, there would be new discoveries to make, new possibilities to explore. Mars experts believe the crew could locate underground ice that could be melted for water. This investigation might change the future of Mars, a dream held both by science fiction writers and by scientists. NASA's Chris McKay believes that we could make the red planet's climate suitable for life through a process called terraforming.
The word means, obviously, to make it like Earth, terraforming. Fundamentally, what Mars lacks is a greenhouse effect. Like the panes of glass in this greenhouse, the carbon dioxide and water in an atmosphere hold the solar energy in and keep a planet warm. Mars's thin atmosphere is essentially equivalent to no greenhouse at all. The first thing we need to do is give it a thicker atmosphere or somehow augment its greenhouse effect. That greenhouse effect would allow temperatures to rise, water to flow, and then life could be introduced on Mars and then life could survive.
In his lab at NASA Ames Research Center, McKay conducted a feasibility experiment to look at one possible way for increasing the amount of Martian greenhouse gases. The basic question was whether soil could be the source for adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere.
We think that at one time Mars had a thick carbon dioxide atmosphere, and that as the planet cooled, that carbon dioxide absorbed into the soil, the way water is absorbed into a sponge. And we think that if we warm up the planet, that carbon dioxide will come back out, reforming a thick, warm atmosphere.
In his experiment, McKay simulates what would have happened to Martian soil as the planet got cold. First, he exposes some soil to an endless supply of carbon dioxide gas. Then he chills the soil to below zero temperatures. After a few days, McKay shut off the gas, took away the cold, and measured how much carbon dioxide came out of the soil as it warmed up again. A mass spectrometer revealed the amount was huge. But the machine indicated that for Martian soil to release carbon dioxide, the temperature would have to go up 40 degrees centigrade from its current temperature of 80 below zero.
If we take what we're currently doing on Earth, releasing into the atmosphere greenhouse gases and super greenhouse gases like CFCs, and do the same thing on Mars and continue doing it, in fact, we could easily get a warming of 40 degrees. That kind of change, of course, would be a disaster here on Earth. But on Mars, it would be just what the doctor ordered.
To begin terraforming, Chris McKay proposes that we deploy factories on Mars to produce potent greenhouse gases. As these accumulate in the air, Mars' greenhouse effect would increase dramatically. More solar energy would get trapped in the atmosphere, the temperature would rise, and perhaps in 100 years, carbon dioxide would start coming out of the soil, releasing another potent greenhouse gas into the atmosphere and raising the temperature. Soon, during the Martian summer, water would melt at the poles. And as some of this water evaporated, another powerful greenhouse gas, water vapor, would enter the atmosphere. The temperature would be high enough to sustain water year-round, and Mars would become a much more Earth-like place.
This is the sort of thing that humans are going to be able to do on Mars. We're going to be able to turn Mars into a living planet. Okay? And so that while the first settlers on Mars will live in tuna cans, and 100 years later they'll live in domes, a few millennia from now they'll live out in the open, on open grassland and pineland, on a human-transformed Mars.
I think life is a good thing, and I think spreading life from Earth to other locales in our solar system and beyond is a positive thing.
The Mars of today is hostile to life, lacking any liquid water on the surface, and colder even in the summer than the coldest it ever gets on Earth. But during the first human mission to Mars, the crew would conduct an important terraforming experiment to test whether the Martian climate can be changed. By constructing a greenhouse that traps heat from the sun, they would find out whether raising the temperature forces carbon dioxide, a greenhouse gas, to come out of the soil, as Chris McKay predicts. After a few days, they would return to the greenhouse to measure how much carbon dioxide has accumulated. If the increase is large, it would suggest that terraforming Mars, making it Earth-like, could really happen. Once humans have set foot on the red planet, dreams can start to become reality. But which dreams will we fulfill? Will we construct settlements here? Will Mars become an extension of the world we live in today?
I think 200, 300, 400 years into the future, we'll have a civilization from Earth that inhabits Mars. And we will have youngsters, second-generation Martians, who will say, hey, my grandmother and grandfather back in the umpteenth century came from Earth. And it will be a relationship, Earth-Mars relationship, very much like an old country, new world relationship we have seen in the past 3 or 4 centuries.
If we do set up a human civilization on Mars, that will create the incentive for further advances in interplanetary transportation. Just as Columbus ventured the Atlantic in 3 ships that were really designed for the Mediterranean, and that no one in their right mind, even a century later, would have attempted an Atlantic crossing with. But once people found out there was something to go to across the Atlantic, once they made something worth going to across the Atlantic, that became an incentive for the advance of naval architecture. So we went from those carracks to clipper ships, to steamships, to Boeing 747s. Now, the same will ultimately be true with Mars.
It has always been our nature to dream the impossible. Soon, we can send the first human explorers to the surface of Mars, safely and economically, using technology that's almost ready today. Getting humans to the red planet could finally answer many of our long-held questions. Why did Mars become so cold and dry? How much water is left on the planet? Was there ever life on Mars? Is there any life there now? And there will surely be more surprises, discoveries we can't even imagine, just waiting at Destination Mars.